a whole number of properties that he owned and he didn't declare in the Register of Interest, his non-declaration of his directorship in a company, and his non-declaration of a contract he had, a RAS contract he had for one of his properties with the council. I think so far how this is being reported is very, very unbalanced and does not reflect the findings of the report. I'm happy to send the report to anybody. It still has not been published, despite the fact that SIPO's letter to me says the appendices of the report are available on sipo.ie where the report has been published, but it has not been published. And I think a very, very one-sided view of the report is being kind of retailed out there, where Robert Troy is saying he welcomes the findings of the report, emphasising that his breaches were inadvertent and so on. The report itself is absolutely damning about Robert Troy. They find that he repeatedly breached the legislation in a serious manner, the ethics legislation in relation to the Register of Interests. They find, I go through it, they go through and find a breach of the legislation in relation to the declaration in relation to properties. They find a breach in relation to the declaration of the directorship of the company. They find a breach in relation to the contract, the RAS contract that he had with the council. You would have the impression from a lot of the media reporting that the SIPO found that these contraventions were inadvertent. SIPO found that one of those contraventions was inadvertent in relation to the rental accommodation scheme, but they found out that his failure to include 1, 2, 3, 4 properties were committed negligently. They found that his failure to include another property and the failure to include his directorship of RMT Management Limited were not inadvertent, involved a failure to take care that the public would reasonably expect of office holders in completing their declarations. Accordingly, the Commission finds these contraventions were committed negligently. They also say, while an individual error, once corrected promptly, may not in itself be a serious matter, the Commission finds that this pattern of omissions or errors in successive declarations was a serious matter. And then they go on to find that the failures amount to a specified act within the meaning of Section 4 of the Standards Act. In other words, he broke the law in relation to ethical declarations by ministers and by TDs. So, two things arise from this absolutely damning finding. The first question, and I think it's a very, very important question for SIPO, is why on earth did they have a report completed, and the date is on the front of the report, on the 21st of October 2024, so well over a month, about 6 weeks before the general election, and they didn't publish it. They suppressed this report, they sat on it for 8 weeks. Like, we know that there's a problem in terms of SIPO's sanctioning powers. They can't really do much about TDs who break the ethical rules, ministers who break the ethical rules. The one thing that they can do is to shed light on it and then allow the public to make their mind up. They had completed this report. I really do not understand. I think there's very serious questions for SIPO as to why they didn't publish this report in advance of the general election. Surely the people of Longford Westmeath had the right to know that my complaints had been investigated, my complaints had been vindicated, and that he had been found to be repeatedly in breach of the legislation, and not just inadvertently, but negligently in a number of cases, that the Commission found it was a serious matter, and that they found it was a specified act as provided for under the ethics legislation. Like, surely the people of Longford Westmeath had a right to know that. It's then up to them whether they decide to re-elect Robert Troy knowing that or not. But it seems that someone in SIPO took a decision not to inform people, which denudes the kind of only power that they have left, you know? So they have this damning report on Robert Troy, that's positive. They can't recommend any sanctions in relation to Robert Troy, but the one thing they could have done was to tell the public about it. So I think there is a very, very serious question there for SIPO that I don't think anyone has asked so far. How it is that I got this report, presumably Robert Troy got this report yesterday, on the 10th of December, when the report says 21st of October. There's no explanation in the report for the delay. There's no explanation in the legislation for any reason that there would be a delay. So there's a serious question there. The second question is a question for Fianna Fáil, whether they think it is appropriate for someone to have been found by SIPO to have breached the ethics legislation to continue as a TD for Fianna Fáil. He breached the ethics legislation not just once, but repeatedly. In no sense has he been vindicated by this report. This report is utterly damning, and I think there's now questions for Micheál Martin about whether it is appropriate for someone to have such a damning finding by SIPO against them to continue as a Fianna Fáil TD.
Given that the SIPO, as you mentioned, SIPO's sole thing is to be able to make a finding and then leave it up to the Oxford authorities to decide whether there should also be any sanction. Given that you now have this, would you be proposing to go to the CPP and propose some sort of sanction, or to at least to seek some kind of sanction against Robert Troy?
I mean, it's difficult for me to see what sanction. That's the problem. Like, what sanction there is going to be at this stage. He isn't a minister anymore. I presume they're not going to make him a minister. I think it would be politically very difficult. If they were to make him a minister, I would say, that's completely inappropriate. But I presume that they won't. Obviously, this issue, the issue with Owen Hayes, they both raise similar issues about like the questions of accountability. The need, fundamentally from our perspective, to have recallability, that like people can't just get elected and go off and do whatever. So I need to consider what next steps really are available to us. But in the immediate term, what I would say is that the ball is in the court of Micheál Martin as to how he responds to this report, and I would encourage him to read the report, not just some of the press reports about the report. And we really need to know why SIPO didn't tell the public this before they had the chance to make a choice at the election.
But if finding like this, if finding this was made against someone who was never a minister and was just merely an ordinary member of a party of similar standing to yourself, it would have been open to CPP to propose that they be suspended from the dole for a period of X number of days without the allowances and salary that goes with it. So the fact that Robert Troy was a minister shouldn't make a difference.
That's true. I mean, the only point is that, like, if someone's a minister and this stuff happens, they should no longer be a minister. Like, definitely. But that you're right that should come on top of any other sanctions that should apply to, bog standard TDs, for want of a better term. So yes, I mean, I think the idea of some sort of sanction and so on would be appropriate. I need to consider what next steps in terms of the CPP.
You've obviously said that, look, there's questions that SIPO need to answer on why this report wasn't released. So have you contacted SIPO and asked them yourself, and what have they said to you?
I haven't. I do understand that The Ditch, who obviously originally published all of these, they have asked SIPO that, and they haven't got any response yet in relation to it. Obviously for me, I have a history with SIPO of making complaints, and complaints taking a very, very long time. I have another significant outstanding complaint in relation to Leo Varadkar, where I had to go to the High Court to force SIPO to investigate it. I now don't know, have SIPO already investigated the Leo Varadkar report? Was it the Leo Varadkar complaint? Maybe they have. Maybe that information existed and could have been in the hands of the public before the election. I simply don't know, because it appears that they are willing to hang on to reports and not distribute them to the complainants and presumably those complained about for at least 6 weeks.
And just on your second point, just in terms of questions for Fianna Fáil, are you specifically saying that Fianna Fáil should consider suspending or removing Robert Troy from their party?
Well, certainly, it's a similar point that we made yesterday in relation to Owen Hayes. Certainly, if we had such a member of People Before Profit who was flagrantly, repeatedly in breach of the ethics legislation, we would not consider it appropriate for that person to continue as a TD for our party. It's kind of up to Fianna Fáil and Micheál Martin whether they hold their TDs to any sort of standards at all, but I think any sort of standards would suggest that it's not appropriate. If you're a party that claims to uphold high standards, it isn't appropriate to continue in your parliamentary party the membership of somebody who has been found to have breached the ethics legislation so flagrantly and repeatedly.
Well, you mentioned Owen Hayes there. Do you think there's still questions for both him and the Social Democrats to answer about not only the circumstances of yesterday, but the circumstances of his selection and his candidacy and his election?
I think the question for the Social Democrats relates to what seems like from the outside a lack of curiosity about his past employment. Like I saw in the first article was published in the Mail, there was a SocDem source quoted as this, and this was referring to his employment in Palantir previously as well as the shares, but it was kind of more focused on the employment at that stage, and the SocDem source, but they weren't directly quoted, so we don't know exactly whether that's an official line, but the Stock Times source was claiming that they didn't know anything about his employment at Palantir. I think, if that's true, if that's the Social Democrat official position, I think that is peculiar. I knew about his employment in Palantir. He did this interview where he speaks about being confidential and so on. So I think there's questions there for the Social Democrats. I think the question for Owen Hayes is really, it goes back to this point about the necessity of recallability. It is very, very problematic. It's less than 2 weeks since the public in Dublin Bay South voted, presumably for a significant subset of the voting population. Palestine was an important issue. They wanted to vote for someone who was calling for sanctions on Israel, was supportive of the Palestinian people, and was not hypocritical on those things. And they thought by voting for Owen Hayes they were voting for someone like that, and they weren't voting for someone like that. They were voting for someone who, on the one hand, was publicly calling for sanctions on Israel, and on the other hand, up until after his election to the council, was, owning shares in a company absolutely implicated in the genocide in Gaza and profiting from that. So I think that is a big problem.
Should he resign?
Well, certainly if I was Owen Hayes, and I don't like to think I would be in that position, I think the only kind of honourable thing to do would be to resign, would be to make a full explanation, would be to give the proceeds of the profit that he made in terms of these shares to relevant Palestinian charities, and then, if you want to, stand again for election on the basis of giving people the information and allowing them to have it. I think that is a problem, and it is, people can see that, obviously we have our differences with Sinn Féin, but the person who lost out was Chris Andrews. In 2011, I was on a flotilla to break the blockade of Gaza with Chris Andrews. We spent a week in an Israeli prison together. People presumably thought, voting for Chris Andrews or Owen Hayes, they're both equally on the side of the Palestinian people. It's clear that wasn't the case, and I think that's very, very troubling.
Paul, just on a separate issue of obviously the information talks, yesterday and I presume still today, you were quite critical of other left-leaning parties going for talks, and you described them as this is a change in the mudguard as opposed to a change in the guard.
Yes. I think, unfortunately, that's what the likely outcome of this election is going to be. Clearly, the numbers are there for a Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael government, and the mudguard that was the Greens is going to be changed into another mudguard. Really, what looks like the only significant question is whether that new mudguard would be the Labour Party, would be the Social Democrats, or would be a group of independents. I think, all of electoral history in Ireland, and the most recent electoral history of 2 weeks ago, suggests that it is the mudguard that gets the brunt of the damage as a result of the right-wing policies that are pursued against what the people who voted for what they saw as progressive parties wanted to see. They're the ones who get damaged. I think there's a strong lesson there for everybody. We hope other people draw that conclusion. We hope that we can therefore see the formation of a strong left opposition bloc in the Dáil, combined with a focus on building movements outside, on housing, on disability justice, on Palestine, and other issues.
And in the Irish Independent today, in its front page, it reported that Ivana Bacik at a weekend meeting with the Labour Party basically said, look, she may agree with that privately, that she's meeting, according to the report, that she's meeting Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael out of courtesy, but in reality she's probably not going to go.
Yeah, I saw those reports. Obviously, I don't know. We now have Ivana Bacik saying two things. One thing publicly to the media, that she's definitely very interested in the coalition. Another thing to the party, saying, no, don't worry, we're not really going to end up in coalition. Which one of those wins out? I don't know.
Paul, you'll forgive me, I missed the start of the
question,
but what is your theory as to why do you think SIPO waited until after the election to publish the report? Or do you have a theory?
I don't have a theory. I think you should ask them.
Sure, yeah.
But I think it is really, really, really problematic. The point I'm making is that SIPO has very, very few powers in reality, but the one power they do have is to shed light on the behaviour of politicians and then allow the public to make their mind up. A decision was made somewhere in SIPO, this report is on the 21st of October, and a decision was made somewhere to sit on that until after the election so the public would not have access to that information. I think that is really, really troubling, and I would like to hear an explanation from SIPO for that.
Also, obviously, as per the report, Robert Troy effectively broke a couple of laws, but
yes.
The report doesn't really say what happens now. I mean, I don't know if there's a space for a Garda investigation. I think that they were going to be looking at it before, but I don't know if that's going to happen now. I mean, the report doesn't really say where we go from here, really, does it?
No, and that's kind of the nature of SIPO, you know? It's not like the best thing they can do is to find fact and then, like, someone else can do something about it. The best people to do something about it would have been the public, but the public have been denied that chance now. Now, I think, in terms of what happens next, basically, there are two avenues where it goes. One is Fianna Fáil. Are Fianna Fáil going to do something about this, or are they going to continue to allow him to be part of the parliamentary party, having found these multiple findings of breaches of the law? And the second is the potential of going to the CPP seeking sanction, which could involve some form of temporary suspension.
And also, obviously, found that he acted in good faith. Do you agree with that? Or?
Well, I think clearly, I think he leaked the report, and he leaked it with a spin, right? So I just would emphasise that in the majority of findings, in the majority of the contraventions, they have a whole section. It's actually interesting. They go through it quite methodically. They go through it kind of step by step, like. But they have a whole section on whether the contraventions were inadvertent, negligent, reckless, or intentional. They find that one of them was inadvertent, and they find that the others, which is a whole series, were negligent. So it certainly would be a very high bar, and it's hard to see where they would find the evidence to find that he acted deliberately. But his spin is that, like, he welcomes the report in some way. It's kind of the implication is that the report in some way makes him look good. Like, it really doesn't for anyone who they found that he repeatedly, negligently breached the rules. They basically find that, you know, as a public representative, as a junior minister, he should have known what these rules were and should have abided by them.